The rise of bromance is bad for women, according to a study made by a nobody from some disdainful, useless university, if you pardon my string of pleonasms. To make things more interesting, what counts as bromance to these people is, from a standards perspective, almost identical to what Islamists might consider haram. There's a reason we call these people the religious left. Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, I hope you really do enjoy my large pack of cigarettes. Many thanks to one of the most thorough and prominent supporters of this channel. So, it's been a while since we haven't had this kind of format and this kind of video format. And part of that is because I've been busy and, well, I'm already starting to prepare things, very interesting things, for the next year. Also, it's been a while since we haven't spoken about sexual politics in this format, and part of that is because we already have an almost weekly podcast where I do this anyway. But sometimes something so insane comes up that is also not in Europe and thus unfit for the weekly podcast that really deserves dissecting. Such is the case with this study, they call it, which allegedly proves, or at the very least heavily suggests, that men starting to take advice from people like me and build their own private institutions outside the regulatory framework of the maximal feminist state is somehow bad for women. Now, the cynical in me is tempted to first and foremost say that even if that were true, it would still be fine, considering how many things in this cesspool that we call the modern society not only explicitly and exclusively benefits women, but it does so oftentimes at the explicit expense of men, particularly young white men, which is the only group still legal to oppress and fuck around with. I say that it's bloody good that there's something that benefits men, and it may be bad for women. But not even I am that cynical, and more importantly, the article we're about to read is hysterical in addition to being full of falsehoods and militant misandrist talking points. So, National Post over in Canada titles, "Rise of the Bromance is bad for women and could become genuine lifestyle relationship study." And we'll read and comment along the way with a view to explain at the end why, if there is indeed a rise of bromance, that's in fact a good thing, and also why the author is full of, well, horse manure. So, the blurb says, what happens if these bromantic relationships really take off? Women actually just become the sexual fulfillers of men and nothing else. That's the worrying aspect. And already the first obvious question emerges. So what? Now understand, this is a study made on college grads by militant misandrist professors, so as a result, one ought to look at it in context. The context being that it is coming from the people who encouraged such things such as the slut walk and women need men like fish need bicycles. So after decades of all of this nonsense, it's surprising and, worse, worrying that men might have taken the advice seriously. I mean, really? But from here on, it gets a lot worse. So let's read. Quote, "The rise of the intimate bromance as a new form of friendship has liberated young men from the stifling bigotries of homophobia, but it imperils young women who are increasingly regarded as little more than targets of sexual attraction, according to new sociological research." Okay, so the first red flag is the phrasing new sociological research. That is in itself a strong indicator that you're about to read a ton of nonsense. In fact, if the entirety of sociologists on the planet were to vanish into thin air, nobody would notice. It's that nonsensical and that useless. But in the spirit of engaging all ideas, including very bad and useless ideas, let's pretend we don't want to helicopter this author and look at the ideas expressed in this article in a serious manner. The first problem comes with the fact that the bromance is, well, never defined in this article. So to work around this problem, we'll go straight to the paper itself and read the definition from there. Well, actually, there is no definition in the original paper either. In fact, the authors spend more than a third of the paper trying to explain what a bromance is, and still don't manage to do that. Now, I'm a bit unsure whether I should make this video longer by reading a bit from the original paper to make the point, or to just drop the link in the low bar, but maybe I should read a bit, because there are also many followers who just listen to these videos and don't have the time to go through their links. Anyway, feel free to skip this portion if you think it's boring. So, as I was saying, they spend more than a third of the paper trying to explain what a bromance is, and upon reading all of it, I'm still none the wiser what these three authors of this study think the bromance is. Now, I'm not going to read you all of their 8-page long attempt at defining it, but a bit of the intro and a bit of the end of it will still make the point. So, the paper is titled Privileging the Bromance, a critical appraisal of romantic and bromantic relationships. And right from the title, I'm sure many of you can already see where this is going. And it goes like this, quote, "The concept of 20th century friendship between both heterosexual and homosexual men is well examined in the social sciences. While friendship is primarily experienced by individuals as a complex psychological phenomenon, its dimensions, behavioral requisites, and prohibitions are nonetheless socially defined and regulated. However, during much of the 20th century, investigations of friendship between men have focused on what is missing, by contrast to what exists in women's friendship, namely emotional and physical intimacy. Recent research established a framework for defining and characterizing the popular bromance term by analyzing heterosexual undergraduate men's perspectives on the subject. That study showed that young men openly pronounce love for their bromances and engage in highly intimate behaviors, both emotionally and physically, which have until recently been socially prohibited in same-sex male friendships. In this article, we examine whether close male friendships have the capacity to rival the intimacy and affection traditionally reserved for romantic heterosexual relationships. We know relatively little about how romantic and peer relationships are similar or different, and this research sets out to examine the similarities and differences between bromances and heterosexual romances, with a specific focus on the nature of intimacy and self-disclosure." Close quote. So, bromance is men being deep friends with each other to the extent that they go on the other end of the continent or the planet to save a friend in need, right? Well, how's that different from what has been going on, well, I don't know, perhaps since forever? Because throughout this article, and also the article from the National Post, which we'll come back to very soon, you'll notice that there is no intellectual concern whatsoever for why many, if not most men, do engage in this and have been throughout history, as even this article acknowledges. Nor is there any intellectual concern for how men in the past used to describe this, which would have helped to compare with the findings of this study, and thus maybe help with the conclusion. Or in plain language, if they had bothered to understand the past, they might have understood the present slightly better, instead of churning out some militant misandrist/feminist talking points. But then again, the past is only relevant if it can be used as a weapon against the enemy. In this case, young white men, officially the most hated upon social group in the United Kingdom. Even more telling to the ideological agenda and interests of the authors of this piece of intellectual garbage that they have the audacity to call a study are the next few paragraphs, which essentially sound like they really want to prove that men being friends with other men is, or at least has something to do, or has to be something homosexual in nature. Because you see, simply being friends is not progressive. If I hadn't known better, I would have thought that this is coming from a militant evangelical think tank bent on policing anything they might think as being gay. The difference between these people and those people, I mean the evangelicals, the difference between them and the priesthood of the religious left currently polluting the academia these days, is essentially only slight differences in language. Listen to this portion. Quote, "The level of physical and emotional intimacy expressed between heterosexual young men is dependent on a number of socio-historical variables. For example, homosocial intimacy flourished before the modern era. Exemplifying this, late 19th century and early 20th century men not only posed for photography in physically intimate ways, but they wrote endearing letters to one another and even slept in the same beds." Now, by that standard, I guess I'm the faggot in chief. Again, the authors of this study are essentially trying to project their own bigotry upon normal people. Because normal people do not, and never have been, referring to two longtime friends sleeping next to each other after a long drink as... they never refer to that as homosocial intimacy, but rather as, "Those drunkards slept in that bed last night. Someone please change the sheets." Anyway, moving on. Quote, "Tripp highlights for 4 years President Abraham Lincoln shared a bed with his intimate male partner Joshua Speed, and that President George Washington wrote endearing letters to other men. However, this intimacy that Tripp described in 2005 began to be policed when the awareness of homosexuality grew in the 20th century, particularly in the 1970s and peaking in the 80s. In this epoch, straight men began to fear being homosexualized for displaying physical or emotional intimacy. Consequently, this interfered with the development of close male friendships. Instead of the 19th century homosociality, late 20th century hyper-masculine discourse arose in response to the mass cultural awareness of homosexuality among Western populations. This was facilitated by the spread of the HIV/AIDS virus, which brought such cultural visibility that it solidified the notion that homosexuals existed in great numbers, something made even more salient by large numbers of gay men dying from AIDS-related illnesses. Accordingly, the General Social Survey and the British Social Attitude Survey showed that cultural homophobia reached unprecedented heights in the mid-1980s and early 1990s. Sociological research from this era highlights that men began to emotionally distance themselves from other men. Lewis wrote in 1978 that men, quote, "have not known what it means to love and care for a friend without the shadow of some guilt and fear of peer ridicule," close quote. Gerard in 1971 showed that self-disclosure, a vital component of emotional intimacy, was lacking between males. Instead, young men knew that they had a friendship with another male when they engaged in activities together, like playing sports, drinking, fixing things, or gambling. The difference between the early and later stages of the 20th century was growing recognition in the latter half that homosexuality exists as a static sexual orientation among a significant portion of the population and corresponding antipathy toward it. Accordingly, Anderson theorizes in 2009 that it was the fear of being thought gay that ended the physical and emotional intimacy that heterosexual men once shared, suggesting, alongside Ibsen and Kellner, that by the 1980s, heterosexual men were severely regulated in their behaviors. Anderson's inclusive masculinity theory and his concept of homohysteria explain this shift in the physical and emotional dispositions of men before the first half of the 20th century and the decades of the latter half. McCormack and Anderson in 2014 more recently defined homohysteria as the fear of being socially perceived as homosexual, something made possible because heterosexuality cannot be definitively proven among straight men in a culture that is both aware and fearful of homosexuality. Subsequently, men are culturally compelled to perform certain overtly heterosexual behaviors and avoid engaging in those that would feminize them. Thus, one way of looking at homohysteria is to suggest that whereas homophobia limits the lives of homosexual men, homohysteria limits the lives of heterosexual men too, and it goes on and on like this for another 5 pages. Now, the reason I chose to stop here for the first part of the reading is because at least it tells an interesting story, one that is at least occasionally true. But a story that is still very far from making the reader, that would be, well, us, me and you watching this, any wiser on how do the authors define bromance to begin with. The closer they get is in the second and third paragraph, where they essentially define deep, likely, lifelong friendship that is not only normal but highly recommended among men. And then they go on this tangent with homohysteria, which, as I said, is an interesting story and occasionally true. Or, as we'd say on the internet, cool story, bro. And I treat this with contempt because if you were to know nothing about recent history, you would be tempted to believe that the United Kingdom, or Europe in general, was some sort of an Islamic state, where you would be beheaded or at the very least lose your job if you were to be perceived as gay. That is what would normally warrant the moniker of homohysteria. Definitely not the United Kingdom in the 1980s and 1990s. Also, I was actually alive and I visited the United Kingdom in late 1990s. Later on, in mid-2000s, I also visited several Muslim countries. And I can attest that there was a harsh difference between the two when it comes to how uptight people were concerning sexual matters, and that would be any sexual matters, not just perceived homosexuality. Yet this author really wants us to believe that the United Kingdom, and by extension most of Europe or the West in general, were homo-hysterical in the 1980s and 1990s. I'm sorry, but that is lunacy. Now, with that said, the paper does make a good point, albeit by accident, namely that in many circles of the society, men have become far more lonely past World War II. That is indeed true. What this paper and the articles written about it do not want to even glance over is the fact that militant misandrism, sometimes known as feminism, is largely at fault for this. To make things worse, the preliminary conclusions presented before going on to present the methods of this study essentially stoop to outright lies. For instance, the authors note on page 7 and 8 that, quote, the cultural adoption of the bromance term represents an increased recognition that young men are permitted to have more diverse and homosocial masculine identities. Their behavior shows that, contrasting to the 70s and 80s and 90s research, young heterosexual men are now able to confide in each other and develop and maintain deep emotional friendships based on intimacy and the expression of one's taboo emotional sentimentality, close quote. So we're supposed to believe that the young men of the 1970s and 1980s, by far the most promiscuous generation in that century, were, so those men at that time, again, by far the most promiscuous generation, they were more constrained than the young men of today? Really? Also, we're supposed to believe that the young men of late 1960s and early 1970s in the United Kingdom, who were, by the way, overwhelmingly white and working class, were less able to develop and maintain deep emotional friendships, including confiding to one another? Really? You have to be Michael Kimmel or some of his acolytes to believe disdainful nonsense like this, because this essentially requires you to believe that a far less atomized society was actually less friendship-bound than the highly atomized and fragmented society of the current year. Now that's the kind of extraordinary claim for which you need to provide extraordinary evidence. And no, papers from militant misandrists like Michael Kimmel do not count as evidence. Sorry, we still work on much higher standards on this channel. But please, by all means, do prove me wrong. I was not in the UK in 1968, so maybe I'm missing something. But usually, if a study contradicts common sense and what you've observed as a well-traveled man, then that study is likely garbage. It's a rule of thumb that failed me only once in several thousands of times I have used it. So maybe this will be the second time and I'll have to change my mind. I highly doubt it, but again, I'm looking forward to be proven wrong. Anyway, so now that we're slightly wiser on what the authors have in mind when they say bromance, let's get back to the National Post article and read some more from it. So we left it off at the second paragraph. Quote, The bromance may not be the progressive expression of enlightened masculinity as it is sometimes described and portrayed in movies, said Adam White of the University of Bedfordshire in Britain. Rather, it may be a regressive development, with especially worrying results for women. His research, based on interviews with male undergraduate students, concluded that men saw their female romantic partners as judgmental and as the primary regulators of their behavior. This led to a generalized disdain for women and the view of romance in which men feel they are constantly posturing and self-monitoring, not only to achieve desired heterosexual sex, but to prevent relationship destruction. Alright, stop right there. Once again, we're hit with the utter obliviousness of the authors of this study, but also by the misandry of the National Post author who is doing anything but journalism here. For instance, an honest researcher would be concerned with some questions such as, is this perceived, quote, generalized disdain for women, unquote, is it a real thing? And if yes, why? And if not, why is there the perception that it may be? Or, is this view of romance in which men feel, quote, constantly posturing and self-monitoring just to get some pussy and prevent relationship destruction, is this view deserved? What is the rationale men have for this view, if it exists indeed? But what I'm saying here is totally haram in academia, because such questions would inevitably lead to highly uncomfortable answers, such as the fact that women in general have indeed become far more judgmental and uncompromising without the corresponding rise in their quality. That is to say, most of the time women still bring to the table essentially the same things as women of the 1920s used to bring to the table, and oftentimes even less than that. Yet their demands have skyrocketed. They artificially inflated their sexual market value, as pickup artists would put it. Now, that's not to say men were not judgmental, or that many may not continue to be today. But while 100% of the expectations on men have been kept, none of their ability to bargain remains tolerated. In other words, men are supposed to not be judgmental and just shut the fuck up and pick up the bill. Oh, and also just take all of the huge torrent of abuse that militant misandrists throw at them through all of the cultural institutions. Part of the relationship that men and women uniquely shared in the past has been wiped out slowly but consistently by the rise of the militant feminist culture, which also encouraged the worst of the worst instincts of women. Extreme hypergamy, of course, being the most prominent example. Well, as it turns out, men are not idiots. They see this, and they do adapt. Pickup artistry, for instance, is an adaptation, not a particularly healthy or sustainable one, if you ask me, but it is an adaptation nonetheless. So is MGTOW, and so is bromance, as these authors call it. And instead of complaining about it, we should in fact sigh in relief, because it could have been much worse. In fact, I still do expect much worse to come, while still hoping to be wrong, but that's a story for another time. So, let's see how these authors see bromance. Quote, a key theme of the bromance, on the other hand, was the freedom to express themselves without judgment and to engage in the emotional intimacy without fear. The rise of the bromance is very, very good for men, White says. It offers young men the opportunity for, as the research found, elevated emotional stability, enhanced emotional disclosure, social fulfillment, and better conflict resolution compared to the emotional lives shared with girlfriends. But it's not necessarily benefiting women, and in fact, it may well be disadvantaging them, White said. Yeah, so? No, seriously. Even if it were true that it is not necessarily benefiting women, who cares? And I mean this as seriously as possible. Why should any man ever, anywhere, in any country affected by the mental disease that is feminism give two hoots over how this affects women? Why should we care? Because I certainly don't, and I have no doubt that the majority of young men agree with me, either explicitly or implicitly. Because make no mistake, most young men don't acquire the language to express this. They just act rationally on the incentives provided in the market. And the incentives are very clear. As a young man, you learn pretty fast that nobody cares about you. Most of the culture actively hates you for simply existing as a young white man, as proven by repeated studies made in the United Kingdom. And marrying a woman is a time bomb with catastrophic results. Heck, in the United Kingdom, even living in the same household with a woman for too long is grounds for severe legal and financial troubles. But just for the man, because women are a protected class, so taking responsibility is not for women. Unless it suits them, otherwise they're innocent little victims. Can you not see how mentally disordered the status quo is? What sane man looks at all of this and says, "Oh, that's great, let's dive in"? Yeah, well, as it turns out, fewer and fewer of them. And most men that could reasonably be classified and as essentially MGTOW don't even know that the term MGTOW exists. And they don't have to. They're happy enough to just find a way to avoid all the huge mess and live a fulfilled life for themselves. Ironically, they're essentially following the quote-unquote advice that feminists kept on having for men. Go away, you oppress us, we don't need men. Well, they're just following the advice, and now that a significant enough chunk of men actually do follow that particular advice, it's suddenly a problem for women. Are you sure, feminists, that that's where you want to go? Because if this is the new feminist argument, then we can safely conclude that feminists, especially female feminists, don't really know what they want. They're emotionally unstable and should never, under any circumstances, be trusted with any decision, neither for themselves and especially for other people. Which is, of course, true. But it is nonetheless fun to watch the spectacular intellectual own goal that the feminists are scoring against themselves. Oh, I made a football metaphor. I hope that's still allowed and it's not toxic masculinity or something. So, considering this situation under these conditions, why should any man concern himself with such ridiculous questions as whether his bromance affects women negatively? The answer is that they shouldn't. Most women never protested the increased abuse of men by the state voted in by the majority female electorate. Most women continue to ignore it even today. Most women turned their look away as the increasingly militant misandrist forces took over more and more cultural institutions. Even today, except the women whose sons suffered because of the false sexual abuse allegations and the dwindling supply of women with decent upbringing, most women still ignore or actively support the status quo. Heck, a significant chunk of women, some would argue the majority, though I'm a bit more optimistic than that, miss no chance to casually crap on men every step of the way. For that, I'll leave a long thread on Plebit, well, on Reddit, in which someone asks men to supply a fact that would surprise women about life as a man. Please do read that thread. It's one of those deeply red pills that are necessary, particularly for young women who would prefer not to be lonely smelling like cat piss when they reach their 40s. But until that changes, and it will change, but just not too soon, we can safely say that most women are at least complicit in this, and as a result it is unreasonable to give two hoots that bromance might negatively affect women. But here's the kicker. The conclusion of this study is wrong. The idea that bromances negatively affect women is essentially pure drivel. Yes, they don't necessarily benefit women, and that's a good thing. Not everything has to actively benefit women in order to be worthy, needed, or even encouraged. But the idea that they negatively affect women comes to the authors of this study from their mentality that any adaptation or change that women might have to make to themselves as a result of market forces is somehow bad. And these are the people who call us sexists and bigots stuck in the past of the sexual politics. Amazing. So, let's read some more and I'll explain why their conclusion is essentially wrong. Quote, the new paper in the Journal of Men and Masculinities, which is Michael Kimmel's journal, so it's a journal of militant misandrist propaganda, which is why you should pirate the article and not give half a shekel to the publisher of that odorous garbage. Anyway, The paper even suggests the bromance could become a widely accepted domestic arrangement, with sex so freely available without emotional attachments through social media, for example, and because bromances occupy such a privileged spot in young men's lives, the bromance could increasingly become recognized as a genuine lifestyle relationship whereby two heterosexual men can live together and experience all the benefits of a traditional heterosexual relationship, according to co-authors White, Stefan Robinson, and Eric Anderson of the Universities of Winchester and Bedfordshire in the United Kingdom. What happens in 50 years, say, if these romantic relationships really take off and men decide, hang on, we really enjoy this, these are much better, we can gain more emotionally from it, we're less regulated, less policed, White said, and therefore women actually just become the sexual fulfillers of men and nothing else? That's the worrying aspect, close quote. Well, I actually do know the answer to this. It won't happen. How do I know this? Well, because certain things never change, and one of these certain things is biology, the other being human nature, which is of course heavily influenced by biology. Men will always want women around. Yes, as a matter of policy, they might, and hopefully they will, I would say, come up with certain new policies to limit the legal liabilities that come from being around women, but the impulse will still be there 50 years from now, for sure. Also, women will still hit the proverbial wall and be miserable if by age 40 they're still not in a marriage-like situation. Again, in general, exceptions do exist. Exceptions to both situations do exist and will always exist. But as a general rule, men will always want women around and women will always hit the wall. Based on these two immutable characteristics, more and more women will learn what happens if you continue to be, well, a basic bitch. Sure, the women who are now in their late 20s and early 30s likely will not learn. They will be what the commies used to say, a sacrificed generation. They will have been sacrificed on the altar of feminism, misandric policies, and misandric culture, but they will live to teach the lessons to the next generation. In 50 years' time, most young women will be quite significantly different than most young women of today. By 2070, sex bots will have become entirely a thing, and maybe even artificial wombs will be a thing, though the latter is unlikely even by 2070. That means that by that time, new incentives would have already cemented in themselves in the market. By 2070, there will be no strong incentive to be a cunt. Like there is today anyway. By 2070, one way or the other, the incentives will have for sure changed. Now, why am I that sure about this? Because, once again, you cannot fight biology. And women are people, and like all other people, they function on incentives. And the incentives will change, either via technology combined with bromance or via societal collapse. Or a combination of the two, let's say Islamization and some technology. 50 years is enough of a time frame for the struggles of the current year to have already been solved, at least for a while, because these things tend to change every other century or so, and we are at the end of an era like that. More on that in a future video. But the point is that women will have to adapt, and they will adapt. Whether they like it or not, whether feminists like it or not, or quite frankly, whether feminists will still exist by that time or not. And that, my fellow deplorables, is a good thing. Women being compelled by market forces to make some changes in their own behavior towards men is something to be desired, punished, and welcomed, and not something to be afraid of. Why are you so afraid of change, progressives? Anyway, this particular subtopic was explained in greater detail on this channel in the video The Next Narrative on Sexual Politics, which I urge you to watch if you haven't done so already. Speaking of those, I really need to make new videos in the Next Narrative series. We'll do that too, I promise, eventually. Anyway, back to the article. It now tries to take us through the history by attempting to summarize what we already read in the longish quotes from the paper earlier in this video. It goes like this, quote, The key historical context of the bromance is the recent decline in homophobia, the paper argues. We contend that the male preference for emotionality between other men rather than women has come about due to a significant cultural shift in the structure of masculinity, reads the paper. The paper notes that in the late 19th and early 20th century, men posed for photographs together in physically intimate ways, wrote endearing letters to each other, and even slept in the same beds in non-sexual contexts. But the increasing social visibility of homosexuality led to a climate of hysteria and stigma. To prove they were not gay, we acted hyper-masculine, White said. As a result, men began to distance themselves from each other emotionally. The paper quotes one scholar to the effect that men have not known what it means to love and care for a friend without the shadow of some guilt and fear of peer ridicule, close quote. Now, as I explained earlier, this is mostly bollocks. Not to mention, it's not particularly universal or even consistent throughout the British culture, although the authors repeatedly imply that their findings are somewhat more universal and not restricted to the United Kingdom. But the next part of the article contains quite a few astonishing claims. Here's the first one, quote, "Women's behavior has also been socially policed and restricted, but women are traditionally freer to express a wider range of emotional behavior, and they maintain friendships through sharing emotions and disclosing secrets. But men shared almost nothing of their emotional life and only knew they were friends if they participated in activities together, like playing sports, drinking, fixing things, or gambling," the paper argues. As times have changed, we've seen homophobia decrease and homosexuality become a more accepted notion within society. What we've noticed is people no longer need to do that, Adam White said. People no longer care about being thought gay, and therefore they can behave in a number of different ways. All sorts of things are now open up for men without them being thought as to be a sissy or a fag, because nobody cares, close quote. Seriously? Well, if that's true, then how come the Soviet Union, which imprisoned or killed homosexuals, was also looking at Stalin and later on Brezhnev kissing other men on the mouth? Maybe, just maybe, it's something else entirely. Maybe, just maybe, various types of behaviors between various subgroups of straight men can and should be analyzed and or explained in terms that do not start with homo something. Because it seems to me that it is the progressive authors of this text, and not the supposedly traditionalist bigots, that seem to believe that anything men do not just is and must be. Seriously. These people seek fags everywhere. That's essentially what I'm trying to say here. I mean, they seem to believe that anything men do, it not just is, but must be sexual somehow. Mind you, this coming from the people that purport to be militant about abolishing gender stereotypes. Told you leftism is a mental disorder. Anyway, the article continues, quote, "It was this modern climate that the bromance emerged, first as a movie genre, a mix of the buddy movie and the romantic comedy. Jonah Hill, Seth Rogen, James Franco, and Michael Cera have all famously played the part. The cultural adoption of the bromance term represents an increased recognition that young men are permitted to have more diverse and homosexual masculine identities," the paper reads, again with this bollocks. Diverse homosocial masculine identities? Really? So the fact that 15 years ago I shared the same cigarettes and the same bowl of food with my best friend and then slept in the same bed, not because having two beds was beyond our budget, meant we had diverse homosocial masculine identities? I mean, do these people even hear themselves when they speak? Or more recently, me and my partner in crime over at the Romanian language channel went to the convention of a progressive leftist party, and we booked a room in a low-tier hostel for the night. Yes, one bed, queen size. We could barely speak after 15 hours of work, the results of which you can find on the Romanian language channel. Of course we slept in the same bed. If I show him this study, he'll insist that we speak about this on the Romanian language podcast too, and I will make another 5 minutes cursing straight video. I mean, seriously, it's almost as if these people do not know and have never known any lower or lower middle class men. And there is some truth to that, as we find out in the last portion of the article. Quote, Today, as White describes it, university residences are full of young men cuddling and expressing emotional intimacies. Everybody's doing it, and there's not even a consideration that they might be gay, he said. The research was based on 30 interviews about the romantic and bromantic lives of male undergrads, each of whom had at least one bromance and one romance in the past year. "We're basically like a couple," one said of his male friend. "We get called husband and wife all the time. It's like having a girlfriend, but then not a girlfriend," said another. "Beyond the need for sex, we found that this cohort of men, bromances performed a very similar and often superior function to romances," it concluded. Close quote. So, this study bases its far-reaching and mostly wrong conclusions over some chit-chat with 30 upper-middle-class students from the sports department. Hardly a representative sample for anything, really. Your average man is not a student at the sports department in Bedford. And that's not controversial to notice. What's a lot more controversial to notice is the fact that they selected for the most pro-gay individuals possible. And that is terrible, because their already crap analysis and methodology yielded an even crappier and useless result, since it gave clues for bromances that very likely do not apply to the wider population. Now, I know it's hard for progressives to grasp, but the vast majority of the public, including the vast majority of young men, are not militant LGBTists. Not even by a long shot. Heck, not even the majority of gay men are militant LGBTists. Quite the opposite. The biggest homophobe that I personally know, that is to say a person that utterly despises the LGBTist lobby, is a gay dude from Bucharest. Nobody hates the militant, degenerate lobby more than that dude, and I'm still working on convincing him to come for an interview for this channel. But he's also quite a busy man. Anyway, the point is that both the methodology and the sampling for this study are fundamentally flawed from a scientific point of view. This isn't science. It's not even advocacy-driven science. It is, essentially, garbage. The few interesting stories buried inside the paper do not even redeem the paper overall. Pure and utter garbage. That is what this study is. Now, once we dissected most of it, allow me to answer to the final claim remained unaddressed, namely that bromances actively harm women, or at the very least have this potential to become actively harmful for women. First of all, it's interesting to see feminists complaining about this after they have complained in the last 7 to 10 years about something called emotional labor, which is allegedly something that women perform and are not paid for. Part of that emotional labor, feminists complained, was the part of striving to provide emotional fulfillment to the men in their lives. So this trend, if it were to be so real, so far-reaching, and so normative as this joke of a study claims to be, should indeed give feminists reason to be happy. I mean, look, men are moving away some of the need and some of that emotional labor. But it's not happening, because both feminists and the vast mentally normal non-feminist majority know very well that the purpose of feminism is not and never has been the betterment of women. If it had been the goal, then women would have not be far more miserable emotionally today than in the 1950s. Again, it's not me saying that. It's repeated studies with serious samples, so not something you'd read in the Gender Studies journal, of course. Secondly, men absolutely do need to get rid of the self-destructing habit of renouncing friendships for the sake of pussy. And that means any pussy, including your wife, even if you were with her for 20 years. Renouncing a deep friendship to please her is invariably the wrong decision. Yet men, in their almost unlimited kindness to women, have been willing to do that in droves, especially in the last 70 to 100 years. The results have, of course, been catastrophic for men. Huge suicide rates, huge depression rates, and enormous emotional misery. For men. Women, of course, have consistently been sheltered from all of this. Until the 1930s, for instance, men's suicide rate was either equal or only slightly higher, or as in 5% or less, than the suicide rate of women. Since then, there has been no country in the world where men's suicide rate is not at least 1.5 times bigger than women's. In most countries, it's 2 to 2.5 times higher. In Europe, except Albania, the ratio is over 2.5 in all of the countries of Europe. As it turns out, misandric divorce laws and lack of a support network are primary predictors of suicide. Not particularly surprising for those of us who don't wear the feminist lens, but a reality still openly denied virtually everywhere in the academia, which is another reason why the academia needs to be stripped of the entirety of its prestige and funding, particularly in the so-called social sciences. Because the academia is useless. If all of them vanish, nothing of value is lost. Thirdly, it is absurd to imply that women having to face up to the reality that the world really doesn't revolve around them and their needs is somehow bad for women. Because as time goes on, women will learn this the hard way and, as explained earlier, will have to adapt. It's not a choice. Nature abhors vacuums. You either adapt or you get wiped away. Both results are very okay with capital N nature. And I say women and not feminists because some of these problems predate feminism, as some of the worst instincts of women have been aided and abetted long before the 1850s. Let me give you an example from the comment section of the National Post article coming from one Aliona Hudson lady from Louisiana. Insane comments like hers are to be commended because it's one of those rare moments when your average woman is honest about the general bullshit that your average woman genuinely believes she's entitled to. Ready? Let's read. So, Aliona says, quote, "Why are all the comments end up being about feminists? What does that have to do with anything said here? Or is it that your explanation for anything a woman does? A lot of men here asked how this can possibly affect a woman. Well, pretty easy. A woman always wants emotional connection with the man. She wants to be part of his life and his best friend. Well, ideally, I guess. So when we daily hear all the conversations that start with me and John, or we decided, we went, or have I told you how me and John did this or that today, we get jealous and it starts to piss us off. We want to be the main person in your life and this just makes us feel like we're not. So we get deeply hurt, and that has nothing to do with being a feminist. It's being a woman. So yeah, if you take your emotions to another person and come home just for food and sex, how is that not a problem?" Close quote. Now I took the liberty to correct the grammar a bit, but you get the point. Now while I was reading this comment, I was swinging between boo fucking who and yeah, so what? But what I am sure about is that this mentality is very, very widespread. And it's a mentality that will be gone much faster than most women dare to imagine. At this point, I don't even care anymore how any of this is perceived. The fact of the matter is that the majority of women did not care for way too many years. So men rationally understood, correctly as it turns out, that the majority of women are okay with the status quo. And the status quo tells men this: men, you're not entitled to sex. And men are increasingly saying, okay, fair enough. The consequence of that, though, is that women will have to learn this: you are not entitled to men's emotions at all, for any reason, even if you are his wife. Don't like it? Go lesbian. Sounds harsh? Well, it kinda is. But as I always say, any arrangement and political regime has its point when it tells to people, tough luck. Because nothing is perfect. Solutions don't exist. Only trade-offs. And contrary to what feminists taught women, there are trade-offs in this too. You don't want to submit to your husband's will? Fine. But he doesn't have to submit to your emotions either. You can kindly fuck off now. The door is that way. Thanks for playing. Yes, it's harsh. But other than feminists, nobody else said it's going to be easy to get emancipated and liberated, or whatever the term is, this week. Women getting rid of the disdainful attitude expressed openly and honestly by Aliona in that example is fundamentally beneficial for women, and definitely beneficial for the society and the human species at large. You're not entitled to men's emotions. Get that through your thick skull. The faster you do, the easier it will be to adapt to mental sanity and be overall happier. Fourthly, and this is the final point, it would be great if the findings of this paper were true, because over the long run it would crush the whole "how does this benefit women" mentality. Again, not everything has to benefit women in order to be good, praiseworthy, and appreciated. Now, while feminists are brutally ignorant and hope that the rest of women are like them, the reality is that women depend on men for everything, including their livelihood. Most women would cease to be alive if men decided not to show up at work for 1 week. It's really that simple. Everything that makes modern women's lives exist is built, delivered, and maintained essentially exclusively by men. It's that simple. And some appreciation would not just be nice, but would utterly be in order. Men, on the other hand, don't depend on women for anything, well, except species perpetuation. And even that might change if artificial wombs take off. Men are hardwired to survive alone for much, much longer than women are. And as it turns out, men's patience with women, with women's hatred and women's utter lack of gratitude is slowly coming to an end. You can't keep on cashing in on one thing and one thing only, while at the same time working tirelessly, either actively by becoming a misandrist, or passively, like Aliona, by supporting misandry, to strip the other half of everything. What's true in economics is true in general with life. What cannot go on will not go on. And with that said, I'll stop here and cede the floor to you. What do you guys think? Are these researchers onto something, even if by complete accident, since the study itself is utter garbage? And if yes, do you agree with their conclusions? What about their implications? And if you don't, why not? Also, please tell me your definition of the bromance, since it's apparently a fluid term and everyone uses it in different contexts to mean whatever the authors want it to mean. So maybe if I collect more definitions, I'll eventually get to a somewhat stable and consistent definition. Maybe. Anyway, so with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous support, and I'll see you all soon on Freedom Alternative.